Thank you very much, Ali. Good afternoon. After that kind introduction, you're bound to be disappointed, but that's on her. It's really an honor to be here in the presence of heroes who really stood up and sacrificed to not just fight against anti-Semitism. I think we're too much in the defensive. But to stand, not just for Zionism, not just for the Jewish people, but for academic freedom, and for liberalism, and for America. And when I said something like that when I was first launching my book, and it was put up on TikTok, it was banned for violating community standards. And I said, which community standards? And of course, they still haven't gotten back to me. I want to start, if I may, on a more sobering note. I want to dedicate today to the memory of Sergeant Neta Yitzchak Kahana and Corporal Ido Voloch. They are the 846th and 847th holy soldiers of Tzahal, of the IDF, to have fallen since October 7th. And as you all know, we're building up toward Yom HaZikaron, to Israel Memorial Day. I'm flying home tomorrow night on that beautiful direct flight from here. May it continue, in order to get back for Yom HaZikaron. And it's quite striking. 2 years ago, my wife, 4 kids, and I would always go to the same, we live in the German colony, we'd go to the same local memorial in the, some of you may know Shira Harasha, in the little, in the little community center right there. Since then, especially my kids, have a very full schedule. They don't go to the local ones. They have to go to Yosef's. They have to go to Ben's. They have to go to this one. They have to go to that one. And they have to watch them triage, to watch them decide which one am I going to go to and which one am I going to not go to. What's going to come into my heart? What can't I let in? Has been devastating. But of course, and this is the flip side, we will end that 25-hour period with Yom Ha'atzmaut. And one of the things I've noticed, I've been in the US now for about a week and a half, and I spent much of February and March crisscrossing the United States and Canada. One thing I've noticed is that in Israel, we allow ourselves to have joy. And too many of my loving, Zionist, pro-Israel friends here in America and in Canada don't give themselves that permission. So I want to give you one piece of homework. I'll probably add more. Have ice cream for breakfast on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And every Jewish school and every Jewish institution, every Jewish family, you know, let them, and non-Jews, let them have ice cream for breakfast on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Why? Because one of the things that Judaism teaches us is that only by having a specific action associated with a specific idea do we perpetuate our rituals. Purim, Hamantash, and a lot of it is food. Pesach, matzah. So let's make an ice cream for August and let it be sweet, because we are still, with all our challenges, with all our trauma, still living in the sweetest epoch of Jewish history. And by the way, I think that goes for America too, but we'll talk about that in group therapy later. I give my students a time machine. I say, tell me another period in history you'd rather be living in. And it's important because one of the things that terrifies me in my crisscrossing around this country and around Canada and in the UK, is the despair that I sense, especially among young people. Democracies are fueled by hope, hatikva. A week and a half after October 7th, they did a poll, and 2/3 of Israelis, while admitting they were scared, were optimistic. And you all know that Israel continues to want to rank in the top 10 of the happiness index in the world. Why? Because there's a sense of purpose. Why? Because there's a sense of tradition. Why? Because there's a sense of community. Why? Because we have no choice but to have hope. And so I want to give you permission to have joy. I want to give you permission, not just on Yom Ha'atzmaut, to not let them win. Because every time they rob us of our joy, we give them a victory they don't deserve. But of course, we're in difficult times. And confusing times. Look at me. I'm a case of Arrested Development, like some of you. I got to the academic world and never left. I loved it so much. I worshipped in the church of liberal academia. I worshipped in the church of open-mindedness. I worshipped in the church of critical theory. Lowercase c, lowercase t. I loved the fact that it wasn't obvious to us exactly where our professors stood politically. And we'd whisper in the corner. I loved the fact that I was taught not to hijack the holy podium of the classroom and turn it into a political platform. I love the fact that the best feedback I got from my students when I was teaching U.S. history, 1865 to the present, and we touched on tough issues, was A, he's a tough grader, but we still like the course. Also, not so it's a phenomenon that's gone these days. But is he left or right? Are you a Republican or Democrat, they'd ask me. I say, it's not your concern. My challenge as an American historian was to give them the tools to decide how they wanted to vote and how they thought it through. I have the best name in the world, Gil Troy. It's clean. I get great reception at Greek restaurants, lots of Helen of Troy jokes. Now a lot of guys go Sparta. And why? Because I'm a story that's similar to many of your stories. I'm one of what we call the Eastern European boat people. All of my grandparents had arrived in New York by the 1920s, before the Immigration Act. And they came over on the boat, as if there was one the boat that brought all of us, all 2 million people from 1880 to 1920. And those of you who were traumatized as I was by watching Barbra Streisand and Yentl, think that there was room on the boat to go tra-la-la and dance. And of course, the passage was hard, the passage was difficult. But our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents made this miracle of America, made this miracle of American Jewry. And my father had one of those names, Troyansky. And he gave himself an Anskiectomy to fit in, because that was the great gift of America. You can fit in, you can belong, you can be a part of this amazing miracle. And we should be grateful for that. But he also wanted his kids to have some sense of rootedness. So he saddled me with this weirdo named Gilad, which is both from the hills of Gilad, but also means joy forever. I sort of made that part up. And there I am in Salma Shesher School of Queens, back in the 1970s. And all my friends have normal names, like James and Elliot and Mitchell and Richard, and I have this weirdo named Gilad. So I gave myself an oddectomy and became Gil Troy. And like so many of you, and unfortunately, too many of our kids these days, I was under that tremendous pressure. Have that sky-high GPA. Have those perfect SAT scores. Write that essay about why you're the most important person in the world, and that's why Harvard or Brandeis or Yale or Rutgers should accept you. And we wonder why our students come with some attitude problems. And I got the brass ring, the golden ring, made it to Harvard University. And I was so excited, I decided to stay on as a graduate student in American history. And there I am, just across the river, teaching in the revolutionary transformation of America as a teaching fellow for Bernard Bailey. And Richard John comes up to me, a fellow TA. And you know how WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, are the real Americans? They have first names that are last names and last names are first names. So Richard John comes to Gil Troy, because Troy, Troy Donahue, Troy Aikman, Troy from High School Musical, and he goes, oh, there are so few WASPs like us around nowadays. And I put on my heaviest New York accent and said, even fewer than you think. And he was shocked. But here's the point, my friends. As you well know, I didn't experience this as a microaggression. We didn't have that word. I said, yes, I pass. I belong. It works. I can put my kippah on when I want, but I can take it off and I can be normal. I can be a part of this great American dream. And that was the experience most of us had in the 1970s, the 1980s, and 1990s. And to hear today about what our students at BU, our students at Tufts, our students are experiencing, is completely unnerving and not okay. I spoke at George Mason University earlier this week. It was the first time since October 7th that I've spoken to either Jewish Studies group or Hillel group that I wasn't behind either a buzzer or an armed guard. That's not okay. And we've become used to it. What do they talk about in Federation Lane? Hardening the target. I don't want to harden the target. I want to broaden the target. I want to ask if I saw we passed the Catholic Student Center. Do they have the same security issues on the BU campus? And I want to say, okay, you know what? We'll volunteer as Jews to guard you if you need it. And they say, oh, we won't need your help. And we said, that's exactly the point. What's going on? And it's a break with what America is. And I was lucky I got a job at McGill University, which is in Canada, that country that everybody used to ignore, but now they don't. Even in the first term, my Canadian friends said that living above Donald Trump's America was like living on the second floor of a meth lab. And I don't care what you stand for, it's a great one. And we know that Canadians are more polite than Americans. And Torontonians are more polite than Montrealers, McGill University is in Montreal. And so every year, right around now, in April, I'm teaching the US history course, 1865 to the present, big, 150, 200 person class. And inevitably, 2, 3 students would come up to me and go, Professor Troy, we're taking off the next 2 nights, they're so nervous, and going home to Toronto. And I'd look at them sternly and I'd say, why? And they go, we're going home for the, and you know that hesitation, that millisecond of, do I out myself as a Jew? And then you say really quickly, we're going for the Passover Seder. So I say, well, will you do me a favor? They go, yeah. You make up the work? They go, of course. I said, do me a second favor? We have a Chag Sameach. Oh, it's Jewish, we didn't know. And then we talked about it, right? And then it became a way of opening up the conversation about the different identity journey we were in. But the point was, we were in control. We were in that story. We could turn it on and we could turn it off as we chose, because that was the American gift. And there I am at McGill University, not October 7th, 2000, September 2000, when Yasser Arafat led his people away from negotiation after the Camp David concessions and never even gave a counteroffer. And all of a sudden, buses are blowing up. All of a sudden, cafes are blowing up. And everybody's blaming Israel. There's all kinds of critiques you can make of Israel, even during the Oslo peace process. But I asked my historian colleagues, I say, has it ever happened in history that a country in a defensive war, i.e. the 1967 Six-Day War, won territory and gave it back voluntarily? The only times I know of are Israel during the peace process with Egypt, 78, 79, and Israel in the first stages of the Oslo peace process, where it withdrew from 6 major Palestinian cities. 80% of the Palestinian population was no longer under Israeli control, but under Palestinian Authority control. And that continues to this day, despite the headlines, in the territories. West Bank, Judea, Samaria, again, we'll talk about that in therapy afterwards. And there I am at McGill University. And Canadians, of course, worship the UN. They haven't got the memo that many Americans got in the 70s and 80s. What did we do wrong? Why is that? We always say, what did we do wrong? Why do we have to carve out a space for anti-Semites? Because they say, oh, no, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. And then we start, oh my goodness, how do we do this? How do we define it? It's on them! I learned that from my gay friends. I learned that from my African-American friends. I learned that from my feminist friends. The burden of proof is on the victimizer, not the victim. The burden of proof is on the aggressor, not on us. And there I am. And you know academics. They can make anything complicated. You go to Starbucks, right? They can write 32 different papers about why do you always sit in the corner typing away because you like the buzz? Why do you always sit with 5 friends solving the problems of the universe and come back the next day even though you didn't solve the problem, but you're still having fun? Why are you willing to spend $7.50 for a Coca Mocha Macchiato that cost $1? Right? And so we could write all kinds of papers about the anthropology and the sociology and the psychology and the economics and the history of coffee. And then all of a sudden, in 2001, when buses are burning, when civilians are being killed, the buzzwords then, Zionism, racism, Israel apartheid. Really? It's that simple? For my smartest colleagues? For my most thoughtful colleagues? And even back then, it broke my covenant with academia. I felt betrayed even then. Had no idea how much worse it would get. And so I started writing, hiding behind that beautiful name, Gil Troy, about the problems of terrorism. And so when the USS Cole is bombed by Al-Qaeda a year before 9/11, but the terrorism in Israel's already started, I write an article attacking the terrorism as Professor Troy at McGill University in the Montreal Gazette. But the worse it gets, and by the way, at the time, most American Jews, most Canadian Jews were quiet too. Because what did we do wrong? We must have done something wrong. I can also feel that despair. And there it is, April 2001. Yom Ha'atzmaut. And I write an 800-word article that changes my life. I come out of the closet from behind my name, Gil Troy, my clean name, in the Montreal Gazette and say, I am a Zionist. I don't do anything to knock down Palestinians because I don't build a Zionism that's anti-Palestinian or anti-Semitic. I talk about how lucky we are to be a part of this exciting experiment in liberal democracy, in Jewish democracy. I talk about how lucky we are to be a part of people who don't just count in decades or centuries, but in millennia. I talk about how lucky we are to have a sense of community and a sense of tradition and a sense of rootedness. in a world that is me, my, more, now, and eviscerates identity. And I define Zionism as one that we're a people as well as a religion. Am Yisrael. Though we have ties to a particular homeland, doesn't preclude others from having ties. But we have ties to that land. And we're the original Aboriginal people. We're the indigenous people in that land. Not to negate others, but just acknowledge who we are. And by the way, if homicide is killing a human being, and suicide is killing yourself, historicide is trying to kill our history. They don't just criticize us, but they also want to rob us of our story, of our roots, which, by the way, is also an assault on the Christian story as well, and on truth. So A, we are a people. B, with our ties to a particular homeland, and C, the rights to establish a state on that land. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, the three pillars of Zionism. And Zionism was moved to establish a state until 1948 and rebuild the Jew, the broken down Yid, to bring pride. Since 1948, Zionism is a movement of national liberation to defend the state when necessary, but to build, rebuild, be rebuilt, and dream always. And since that moment, in addition to still writing about American history, I've been writing more and more about Israel and Zionism. And in 2007, my wife and 4 kids and I, 5, 7, 10, and 12, went on sabbatical to Israel, in terms of the world's longest sabbatical, and we're still there. I'll get back to that in a sec. But as I started commuting back and forth between America and Israel, and as I still have an affiliation with McGill University, but drove my college president crazy by doing all these what they call shminiyot ba'avir and changing things around, it was shocking to me to see how two things grew and grew. The assault on liberalism and liberal thought in the academy. We call it woke. They go, what, you're Trump and DeSantis? I said, no, this isn't a left-right issue. This is a right-wrong issue. We call it critical race theory. They say, what, you're not a critical thinker or you're a racist? We call it postmodernism. They go, what are you talking about? So I decided to call it the Academic Intifada, because they've been yelling Intifada, Intifada from the river to the sea. Many of them don't know which river, many of them don't know which sea. But let's call it out. And I see that happening even before October 7th. And things are getting worse and worse for Jews on campus, but things are also getting worse and worse for free thinkers on campus, for professors who won't sign statements of DEI. And I'm all for fighting discrimination. But one of the things I've discovered, one of the things academia in this latest iteration has taught me, what's the definition of a really bad idea? A really good idea that goes all accelerator, no brakes. I could take any one of those words, microaggression, macroaggression, intersectionality, and see that there's a kernel of a really good idea and a really lovely value. But when it becomes an orthodoxy, when it becomes weaponized, when it goes all accelerator, no brakes, then it becomes toxic. And so I'm seeing these two things simultaneously. So when I read Jonathan Greenblatt's statement, I should emphasize I'm speaking just me personally. I don't represent this wonderful organization. And he says that the issues of fighting anti-Semitism should be addressed as it is on its own process, own merit, and other debates on higher education may be important, but they can and should be resolved separately from fighting anti-Semitism on campus. I say, good luck, but you're not going to win. You're not going to win the battle because the two became intertwined. Because what is anti-Semitism? I prefer to call it Jew hatred because anti-Semitism is so sterile and clean. Jew hatred is a parasite. One of the things I learned from October 7th is Jew hatred is about obsession, right? We see this from the far left and the far right. It's an obsessive hatred of the Jew, either the individual Jew, Jewish institutions, Jewish ideas, Jewish values, or the Jewish state. An obsessive hatred that then goes into all kinds of conspiracy theory and, as Natan Sharansky pointed out, becomes delegitimizing, demonizing, and holding Israel or Jews to the double standards. And that obsession is so important. And so what we saw was the parasite of Jew hatred was linked to this parasite going on in the university. And to try to justify Jew hatred cleanly like that is a fool's errand. So trigger warning. I'm going to touch on the hot issue of the moment. And I just mentioned about Newton, so I heard every argument against Donald Trump's anti-Semitism initiative. Here's my problem. Let's take a cleansing breath, because I know we're not good at these kind of conversations. Problem number one. I grew up in a world where my Rebbe was Mayor Ed Koch. Ed Koch said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. The notion that any individual is all good or all evil, let alone a politician, the notion that everything is all or nothing is toxic to democracy and not the way to go forward and not the way for us to learn how to talk to one another. And by the way, one of the great betrayals for me of academia, long before I came out as a big mouth Zionist, was that no one in my department ever came to me and said, you know, I disagree with you methodologically. You're an old-fashioned, traditional narrative political historian. I'm a social historian, or I'm a quantitative historian. Let's talk. Let alone if you disagree politically. There was no more conversation. If you disagreed with me, you were wrong and you were evil. How do we learn from one another? I went into academia to learn from others, to sharpen my skills in loving disagreement. So one is we have to live with complexity. Two, there is a problem of anti-Semitism on campus, and as I say, it's linked to the broader problem on campus. Three, Trump's initiative against anti-Semitism is the most powerful, most aggressive move against anti-Semitism by any president in American history. Now, what do we do with the fact that many of us have criticism of Donald Trump? Because number four, as a presidential historian, I would say that Donald Trump has taken a sledgehammer approach to leadership. And David Brooks of the New York Times points out that he's actually asked many of the right questions, he just gives many of the wrong answers. And the problem with the sledgehammer approach to leadership, to immigration, which most Americans fundamentally agree on trying to solve the problem, to cutting government, which most Americans fundamentally agree we need to cut government, to fighting anti-Semitism, the problem is the sledgehammer approach. There are slivers that go that can be not just harmful, but lethal. So people say, well, do you really believe that Donald Trump is sincere in hating anti-Semitism? I say, that's not the question. People say, do you really think it's going to work? I say, that's not the question. The question we have to ask, and we have to reframe it, is what do we do? How do we take what's happening and shape it to our advantage? How do we acknowledge the fact that there's a disparity? 160 universities came out with a very powerful statement in favor of campus autonomy. I'm all in favor of campus autonomy. The last thing I want, and the last thing conservatives or liberals should want, is big daddy government coming in and dictating what happens on campus. But 80% of the letter that went to Harvard, I agreed with. And it hurts me that in a year and a half, I didn't hear 160 college presidents, you can certainly attest to that, stand up and say, this is no good. And so there's an imbalance here. And I've been very careful. I don't attack free speech issues. I attack bad acts. So at MIT, when students were blocked from attending classes, and the president at the time said, oh, well, if we hold them to the standards that we articulate in our student handbook, therefore it might affect their immigration status. This goes back a year ago. This didn't offend me as a Jew. This offended me as an educator. My job isn't to protect students from the consequences of their actions. Educators are supposed to hold students up to standards, articulated, and especially because they did that by helping them. She betrayed the students who were blocked from going to campus. Not only Jews, but non-Jews as well. So the question is, how do we fight in this complicated environment? And simply saying we're in favor of due process, simply saying we're in favor of free speech doesn't cut it. And so we have to focus on the specifics, which first of all talk about things like, why is it that it's okay for me to protest with a mask? And if I don't have a medical excuse, why isn't it wrong for me to put an ID? That's logical. That comes from this push. There's been more progress, I'm sorry to say. I wish it wasn't true, but there's been more progress at Columbia. And I think even at Harvard in the last couple of weeks than there was before, even though there were some changes at Harvard in the last year and a half. We need viewpoint diversity. I don't want it imposed on by the federal government, but how come it's not coming from within? So I think we need to have a conversation within the Jewish community, within the pro-Israel community, among alumni. And one of the geniuses about this organization is you figured out that you have to figure out what are the pressure points in the university. And our biggest failing, and I'm just talking to you about this, Stuart, is that we're keeping the conversation within the Jewish community. until the upper middle class parents of Blue America, and I'm speaking grossly here, understand how dangerous this is to them, and to all they've done to invest in this credentialing factory. And by the way, when I travel around and I speak to students, I don't ask them where you're going to school. It doesn't matter whether they're 7 or 27. I don't ask them, what are you going to do when you grow up? What are you going to study? Because that's basically saying how you're going to make money so you can survive in this crazy country. I say, how's your soul? And they look at me like I'm nuts. One person said finance. I said, wrong answer. One person hugged me. I think we have to see the degree to which our rabbis, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, our community leaders, our parents model to the kids that the most important thing is that credential. The most important thing is getting into the right schools. And again, I'm part of that system. We have to critique it a little bit. And so we have to start saying that this is a problem, and to our friends in our neighbors in upper middle class Blue America who worship in the church of the Ivy League, who worship in the church of the select universities. We have to say, look at the reputational damage that's being done. Look at the distortion. I think that parents of this generation who are spending $60, $70, $80, $90,000 a year for this kind of brainwashing, which is just boring, as well as toxic to America, are among the dumbest people I've ever met as a group. So until they recognize how dangerous this issue is, we're in trouble. And as long as it becomes a left-right issue, and as long as it is a pro-Trump, anti-Trump issue, we lose. And so we have to start focusing on the problems of anti-Semitism in campus. And yes, we have to say, with all due respect for all the good work that ADL does and Jonathan Greenblatt does, that no, you can't separate out the two. And that's why it's so confusing. I want to end and open for questions by going back to Israel and going back to my family. Because since October 7th, we've endured crazy things. My son Aviv, who served as a commando and finished his service in August 2023, and so was in Sri Lanka, Colombo, Sri Lanka, on October 7th, and like 200,000 other Israelis heard about it, instead of running away, ran home. And like so many of you, instead of running away, have come and embraced us and helped us, and you have no idea how meaningful that is, how special that's been for us. My son Aviv moved heaven and earth and ends up flying home late Sunday night and lands in Dubai, and he's at the Carol waiting for his luggage. And he opens up his WhatsApp and discovers 5 of his close friends had died in the Battle of Kfar Aza. And he flies home at 1 o'clock in the morning, Monday, after October 7th. We pick him up at Ben Gurion Airport. We're driving in. We're asking about his friends. And he's telling us about so many friends. This one, Oren, was in Auckland, New Zealand, flew to Tahiti, then Los Angeles, stayed overnight at a friend's grandfather's house, and then flew back to Israel. Next time I saw him, I said, Oren, didn't you go to school with Aviv? Oh, yeah. I said, did you learn geography? But that's our geography. It's a geography of love. It's a geography of commitment. It's a geography of the Jewish people. And then as we enter Jerusalem, he says, I've got to tell you, Ben is missing. Ben Mizrahi, 22 years old, grew up in Vancouver, decided to spend the gap year on a program war with Israelis, and became very good friends with my son and his gang. And Ben was so close to our family that he was already designated as the barbecuer in chief for my older son, Yoni's wedding, which was supposed to take place November 26th, which you lot call Thanksgiving Sunday. We just call Sunday, but we're going to have a lot of visitors from out of town 6 weeks after October 7th. And Aviv said to me the worst thing he's ever said to me when I drove him to the base. He said, I hope Ben's dead. Because you couldn't imagine him in the hands of these beasts. And when I dropped Aviv off, I said to him, Aviv, I'm speaking to you as an American historian, not a father now. I've read Michael Walzer on just war theory. I've watched what America did during the Civil War and World War I, World War II, after Pearl Harbor. I've watched what America's done in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would add now, and I heard the silence then of all my close friends who never said anything about what America was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and the collateral damage there. I said, the moral onus of this war is on Hamas. Everything that happens, and if God forbid you end up shooting your commander in the head, it's on them, not on you. Everything that happens is their fault. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't fight as morally as possible, not for them, but for your own soul, for your own sake. But morality in war is kind of trying to look for chocolate fudge that isn't fatty. War itself is a break with morality. And so we try to be as ethical as possible. And I have to say, I'm standing up here saying I'm so proud of how Israel has minimized civilian casualties as much as possible. And I go to Hillels and I go to universities and people want me to apologize. I will never apologize for Israel. And I don't judge Israel by Syrian standards. I don't judge Israel by Chinese standards. I don't judge Israel by Ukrainian and Russian standards. I judge Israel by American standards, by the Battle of Mosul. Anyway, on October 9th, they found Ben's body. So October 10th, we went to his funeral in Magalei Yavna, the kibbutz that had adopted him because he decided to stay, served in the army, had gone for his trip to South America, and then had gone to the Nova Festival. And at that moment, like so many of you, I was stuck. I was stuck in Shoah, Holocaust. I was stuck in pogrom. I was stuck in despair. I was stuck in the fact that so many secular Israelis called it the worst day, not just in Israeli history, but in Jewish history since the Holocaust, because they saw how anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism melded together and reinforced one another. And we saw it on college campuses here too. Had they waited until Israel invaded Gaza, then we'd say, okay, this is about what Israel does. But the speed and the joy with which they were exhilarated by the perversions of October 7th showed that about what Israel is, not what Israel does. And that Israel is, and that the Jewish people are. And so we're in this paralysis. And yes, the Israeli government failed that day, and the IDF failed that day. And we come to the funeral. And the first person who speaks tells the story of Ben. Ben and his friend Itai could have run away, but instead they ran back in. And having served as a combat medic, he was trying to help. And the last picture we have of Ben is a still photograph from a video of him crouching behind a police car with a medical backpack on his back because he'd broken into an ambulance, which he didn't learn in Vancouver, and was trying to save people. And at that moment, I flipped the switch, and this is the switch we have to flip. I went from despair, from paralysis, from failure, to the miracle of Israel and the miracle of Zionism. Zionism never promised us a rose garden. We're all going to read on Yom HaZikaron, on Memorial Day, the famous poem that came from Chaim Weizmann's statement that a state isn't handed on silver platter. Israel failed. Government failed. Israelis saved Israel on October 7th. Our kids, many of your friends, mobilized and fought. And Zionism gave them the methodology. Zionism gave them the ideology. Zionism gave them the framework. And when I tell that to students on campus, I say, I'm not telling this to shame you, to tzahal shame you. I'm telling this to empower you. Because my kids, for all their courage, and they've served hundreds of days in Miluim and reserves, know what it is to go through a door and not know if there's an IED explosive device waiting for them, or a sniper as there once was in a closet. But they have each other. And when they look at you, they see a courage at Brandeis, at BU, at Tufts, at Harvard, that they don't need, that they can't imagine. The courage to stand up, even if just to wear a little hostage tag. It takes courage because you're risking social ostracism. The courage that it takes even to wear a t-shirt that says, Dina's bat mitzvah was awesome. Because being Jewish, not just being Zionist, is no good. And so my kids admire your kids and our students. And that's the kind of Jewish community we need to build. That's the kind of pro-Israel community we need to build. Respecting one another, building one another, fighting together, sifting out the partisan noise, sifting out the Trumpian confusion, sifting out the amorality in so many universities. And as I said at the beginning, being good Zionists to save Israel, to save the Jewish people, but also to save the Academy and the United States of America, and frankly, the West. Thank you very much.